This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 689, entitled Women's Studies Professors Damage Their Female Students. Description. This flyer claims that women's studies professors damage their female students by making them misandrist, due to these professors' monoconsciousness, thus passing on their attitudes to their students that gender oppression is a one-way street. The misandry of the female students then makes them repulsive to young men who, 2/3 of them, refuse to even date young women, thus making these women miserable. The solution to this problem is to teach masculism as part of gender studies courses, so that young women lose their monoconscious misandry and become much nicer for men to be with. Moral pressure can be applied to gender studies professors to teach masculism in their classes by their female students, by professorial colleagues, by presidents of universities, by demographic politicians, etc., so that gender studies courses are made biconscious, that is, both feminist and masculist. The flyer itself. Women's studies professors damage their female students, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. One of the dominant gender political realities of our modern times is that in the US today, 2/3 of young men don't even date young women, which is the result of an opinion survey taken by the reputable opinion polling company Pew, P-E-W, Research Center in 2022. When asked why, these young men said, quote, "Because these women are undateable." When asked why, these young men said, "Because they have been so poisoned by feminism." It's now an easy logical step to make the claim of the title, which goes as follows. What do women's studies professors teach their female students? In essence, how men oppress women. There is no mention at all in such classes, nor in feminist books, how women oppress men. So not surprisingly, these female students come away from their women's studies / gender studies courses with the impression that gender oppression is a one-way street. So again, not surprisingly, they are angry at men for the ways that men oppress women. This is not to say that men don't oppress women. Men obviously do. One only has to attend some of these women's studies lectures or public lectures on the same topic to see that this is true. Men do obviously oppress women. For example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, patriarchy, misogyny, etc. If I were a woman, I'd be a feminist, although hopefully a biconscious feminist, but more on that later. There is as yet no real general masculist consciousness in society. As evidence of this, ask almost anyone what they associate the term gender politics with, and in nearly all cases the response will be feminism, for the simple reason that the only gender politics they have ever heard of over their whole lives is feminism. So it's not surprising that nearly everyone of either sex has been brainwashed by feminists into the view that gender oppression is a one-way street. This idea is deeply ingrained into people's minds. Most people have never been exposed to masculinist ideas, so when they think of how people gender oppress people, they automatically think of men oppressing women, because the reverse idea never occurs to them, because they have never heard of it all their lives. Now, young women who come out of women's studies courses are women, so feel themselves potential victims of men, since this is what they have learned from their women's studies professors for months at a time, case after case of how men oppress women. So of course they are angry at men and are motivated to change this oppression by hitting out against it. One of the major goals of these women's studies professors is to cause society to change so that this gender oppression of women by men is stamped out. And a very effective way to do this is to educate millions of young women to be angry at men for the ways that men oppress women, who then proceed to stamp out the oppression of women by men. But there's a price to be paid by these young women as they move out into society with their university-acquired misandry, bolstered by their feminist knowledge of how men oppress women. That price is that from the point of view of a young man, the misandry of these young women makes these young women a pain in the ass to be with. So not surprisingly, young men prefer not to be with such young women and avoid them. This in turn causes real misery for these young women, since, being young women, they need to bring a man into their lives so that he can help pay for her to have babies and raise kids, which is what females evolved to do. It is a deep instinct in women to want to raise the next generation for obvious Darwinian reasons. Those women who were less inclined to want to raise the next generation were more likely to die out, thus genetically selecting women who were more likely to want to raise children. With two-thirds of young men in the US now refusing to even date young women due to their feminist poisoning, causes massive pain to these young women, because in not being able to even date a man, these young women will be deprived of sex, companionship, love, babies, and will be condemned to live a manless, lonely life. There are now thousands of TikToks of young women, 20s, 30s, in tears as they wake up to the reality that they're not going to get a man, because that is their experience. After years of trying to find a good man who is prepared to help pay for them to have and raise children, they come to the conclusion that there are fewer and fewer such men and become deeply depressed by this growing reality. So, it's an easy claim to make that the root cause of these young women's misery is the misandry taught them by their monoconscious feminist gender studies professors, as stated in the title of this flyer. So what can be done about this situation? The obvious solution is to stop these young women becoming misandrist in the first place, so that they are nicer for men to be with, so that young men are more prepared to date them, to have relationships with them, and to be fathers with them, helping to pay for these young women to raise children. So how to stop the growth of misandry among young women? I see two basic ways. One way is to simply stop women's studies courses, but that is not practical, since women's studies professors are utterly convinced that men do oppress women, and that such a reality needs to be taught. So suppression of women's studies courses would only be possible in a dictatorship. Since universities are increasingly being taken over by women, it's unlikely that such a suppression could occur. So I reject this first way. The second way is to teach masculism in gender studies courses. Why do I say this? It's my experience, and of many others, that once a woman, or a man for that matter, becomes aware that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men worse than vice versa, then a woman's feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women is cancelled by her female masculinist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men. That women oppress men is something that masculism preaches to men, to women, to society. It is a reality, so it too should be taught. One way to teach this is to have men's studies courses on campus, but in my view that would be suboptimal compared to having both feminism and masculism taught in the same class. If there are separate women's studies courses and men's studies courses, then the potential intergender hostilities will only increase, since if the women in the women's studies courses learn only how men oppress women, and if the men in the men's studies courses learn only how women oppress men, then the two sets of students, male and female, will become mutually hostile to each other, which will only strengthen intergender hostility. It's smarter and more practical to teach both gender politics, feminist and masculist, within the same course. Then female students of gender studies courses will be a lot less misandrist due to their awareness that in reality women oppress men worse than vice versa, with their horrible decades-lasting gender crimes against men of women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc., which are far more serious gender crimes against men than men's against women. So what should the next steps be in defusing the generation of misandry within women's studies courses, within gender studies courses? The first step, in my view, is to spread masculist ideas a lot, in capital letters, more, so that the general population becomes aware of masculist ideas and accepts readily the idea that gender oppression is truly a two-way street. Then moral pressure can be applied to the universities to gender fair the gender studies courses. There are, after all, two genders, so it's only fair that the gender politics of both genders be taught, rather than only one, that is, feminist. In practice, this could take the form of lawsuits against universities that have only feminist gender studies courses, claiming that these universities generate misandry by cherry-picking examples of gender oppression, that is, by men against women, and saying nothing of the reverse direction. Moral pressure can be applied by professors against their misandrist women's studies professorial colleagues, claiming that the latter are misandrist hypocrites who take the view that it's okay for women, for feminists, to lash out at men for the ways that men oppress women, but it's not okay for men, for masculists, to lash out at the way that women oppress men. Which, of course, is deeply hypocritical and generates masculist hatred of such misandrist, hypocritical, bigoted, monoconscious, feminist gender studies professors. Moral pressure can also come from the female students who want to study gender oppression, but from a bi-directional point of view. These young female students will reason that they don't want to be manless by being made misandrists by monoconscious feminist gender studies professors, because they know that if they, as young women, become misandrists, then they will repel young men, and hence be doomed to manlessness, and hence babylessness, etc. Young women don't want this, so can push their gender studies professors to teach them masculism within their courses as well. Presidents of universities can also apply moral pressure on monoconscious feminist professors of gender studies to teach masculism in their courses, encouraging them by saying such things as, quote, "If your courses are biconscious, you will make our university look more modern, gender politically fairer, and that will increase your chances of promotion." End quote. From the point of view of politicians, a pressing case exists to persuade young men to be fathers again. Otherwise, we die out. With 2/3 of young men in the US today refusing to even date young women, this is a demographic catastrophe. So I can imagine soon biconscious, that is masculisted, politicians will be calling up the presidents of universities and telling them, ordering them, to teach biconscious gender politics in their gender politics courses, so that female gender politics students are made less misandrist, less feminazi bitchy, and become a lot nicer for men to be with. It's important that politicians do this, since if not, then whole societies will be increasingly threatened by annihilation due to the demographic catastrophe caused by young men refusing to date young women, hence refusing to mate with them. So with all the above moral pressures coming from all sides onto monoconscious feminist gender studies professors to add masculinist ideas to their courses, it is likely to happen. To push this process along, the masculists need to spread masculinist ideas more vigorously to the public, educating people that gender oppression is a two-way street and that women oppress men worse. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, click on the Masculist tab for 680 plus Masculist essays and their videos. Google the terms London Real and Hugo de Garis to see videos on masculism at AI will kill 1 billion people dash do we create our exterminators question mark Professor Hugo de Garis dash London Real in brackets. See the last half hour of this 2-hour interview for the Masculist segment, as well as, quote, Countdown to Extinction, How AI Will Exterminate Mankind, close bracket, quotes, again for the last 40 minutes on masculism. These flyers are available in text and video formats on Minds, BitChute, Odyssey, MGTOW.tv, X and YouTube, in brackets, although well down in the search list, since YouTube has shadow banned my masculist videos.